This is an interview for the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales Oral History Project. The interviewee is John NIland, and I'm the interviewer, Judy Hughes. The date is the 30th of November, 2021. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
Can we start with your early influences in life, where you're from originally, and a bit about your family background?
I was born in Kyogle, which always created a problem with passport control with pronunciation. Ended up growing up in Lismore. My father was a one-room bush school teacher. He used to go out into the bush every day to teach about 25 kids all in one room. I ended up going through Lismore High School. At the end of that, I got a train from Casino down toward Newcastle and Sydney, and that's what then led me into industrial relations. It was all by accident, I have to say. There was nothing planned about it. I was not a particularly keen student. I ended up doing well enough to get admitted to where I needed to go, but my interests were mainly in athletics and things like carrying the Olympic torch in 1956 and that football, that type of activity. Eventually I got my academic feet on the ground and went on to that direction, but initially I was anything but a good student.
And where did you carry the Olympic torch?
Sorry?
Where did you carry the Olympic torch for the?
Oh, I carried the Olympic torch outside Lismore in 1956. It was at a time when the torch went right through the country. It was a genuine torch and it was a genuine run. It was a mile, not a kilometre, run by about 20 people passing the torch back and forth to one another. It was very hot. It was very heavy. I just turned 16, but I remember it very well. It's just one of those experiences that you put at the back of your mind and think of every now and then. But that was more reflective of me at school than the books and the library and things like that.
So you didn't see yourself as a very good student in those years?
I didn't really think about it. I ended up going on to do the leaving certificate because all my friends were, not because I thought that's what I wanted to do. Then I realised that I didn't really want to stay in Lismore. I wanted to move out and beyond. And that's then took me by accident into industrial relations. The BHP were visiting the Northern Rivers and doing interviews with students who might come and work as commercial trainees. And I got on the train in Casino, which is just out of Lismore, to travel to Sydney. I had in my pocket admission from Sydney University Law School and from BHP, and I had to make a decision by the time we got to Broadmeadow whether I was getting off the train there or whether I was going to go on to Sydney. And I had like 10 hours of lather in indecision, but eventually I decided to get off the train in Broadmeadow. Next day I went to BHP. They interviewed me, offered me a job as a commercial trainee. They then had to work out which department to put me in. They asked me what I was interested in. I said economics, ancient history and law. They said, well, we don't have an ancient history department and we don't have really a law department. In fact, we don't have any of that, but maybe industrial relations would be right for you. So they sent me downstairs to the IR department and I sat there for 3 years as an industrial relations trainee and assistant, doing work that I found very interesting increasingly. They identified which university course I would do and they enrolled me in that. I turned up for lectures and it sort of grew on from there. The Industrial Relations program at the University College in Newcastle, which was a branch of the University of New South Wales, had been funded by BHP. They saw that as a growing area and they wanted tertiary education people qualified, and there were about 4 or 5 of us in the program, including John Prescott, who ultimately became CEO of BHP. We would travel to Sydney 1 day a week to do lectures that couldn't be done in Newcastle. I did that for 2 years and then got a scholarship with BHP to go full-time to the University of New South Wales. Went into Bassett College, started to come on from there. The Industrial Relations program I was enrolled in was the first in Australia, and that group of us were, I guess, the first cohort of people studying industrial relations. And it was an increasingly eye-opening experience and something I fell in love with. But it was an accidental progression. It was a random walk, if you like. It was not a career plan step by step by step. It was something quite different.
So you didn't know about anything about industrial relations when you started at BHP. Oops. You said that it was a bit of an accident that you went into industrial relations, so presumably you didn't know much about that as a field. When they said they wanted to send you into that department, what did they tell you it was about?
There was very little information really. It was just a judgment that you'll be best in industrial relations. I was sent down. There were three of us in the office. We shared the one desk, and there was a program of development which entailed, for one thing, showing the Industrial Commission judges around the steelworks on their inspection tours. That was very interesting. You know, we went to blast furnaces and coke ovens and other rolling mills, and I was in charge of getting water for the judge. I had to make sure he knew where the nearest toilet was as we walked around the steelworks. That went on for a couple of years. In Sydney, during those visits down to do the lectures, they'd often keep us over for a day or two to sit through the award hearings in the Industrial Commission. Bill Fisher was the judge involved in it at the time. I found that interesting, but ultimately I found it also rather tedious, the sitting at the back of the room in a hard pew with all of the slow process of the tribunal. And I guess ultimately when I went off to America and became much more interested in bargaining as a process for dispute resolution, that experience with the tribunal process bore on my mind. I looked at the two, but at a very young age, so probably not well based to make a mature judgment. But as I did at that time, back at University of Illinois or Cornell University, the conclusion I reached was that I'd rather be away from the tribunal process and much more involved in a lower centre of gravity and having industrial disputes and issues settled between the parties on site. Now, that turned out to be a brave notion because you introduce a system of enterprise bargaining, and of course it needs care and feeding every day. Otherwise it'll become something else, which I think is what's happened today.
And so can you just describe your academic life then? So you were, where you started university and why you decided to go overseas?
Yes, I loved university. I turned up to the campus each day from Vassar College, and I thought it was a great experience. I was involved in almost everything, you know, ranging from the rowing club to the debating club. I was president of the Students' Union. I was ultimately a member of University Council. The more I had to do with the university life, the more I realised that that's what I wanted to do, that's what I wanted to stay with. The hard thing was going to BHP and explaining that despite their wonderful support for 4 or 5 years, I was now leaving and I was staying at the university to do a master's degree, which I did in labour history, really, the origins of the 8-hour day and how that emerged in Australia first of all in the world. That increasingly made me convinced I wanted to be an academic and not something else. Bill Ford, who was one of the teachers in industrial relations at the time at UNSW, helped me select University of Illinois. He was a mentor in that sense. I went there. I was the first Australian to do a PhD in industrial relations, and I was their first PhD graduate. So it was really doing things that hadn't been done much before. So it was a bit of a fly in the dark, a leap of faith, but it turned out to be, you know, such a great leap that I've never had any regrets. From Illinois, I went to Cornell for a number of years. While I was there, I was a registered mediator in labour disputes in New York State, and that I enjoyed very much. Ultimately, we had to decide whether we were going to stay on, take citizenship in America, or come back to Australia. My wife and I decided on the latter. We came back. I was at ANU there for a couple of years, and then lo and behold, University of New South Wales created the first chair in industrial relations. And as a precocious 32-year-old, I put my hand up and was selected, as it turned out, and started the job at about age 32. A number of my colleagues kept referring to it all as the boy professor, but I got older and that became less and less the way they talked about it. And then I moved on through university life to head of school, to dean. I was doing other things outside the university as well, but it was essentially the university in which I was interested. Then ultimately I was very fortunate to get appointed as Vice-Chancellor at the University of New South Wales, and that in a way completed the storyline of my life within universities. I finished up as Vice-Chancellor after 10 years and then moved into the corporate world, which I found interesting, but more of my time was spent still within university circles, but offshore in Singapore and in Hong Kong. And I probably spent half the year in one or the other places for much of that time immediately after I left the Vice-Chancellor's job.
And what interested you in industrial relations in the academic arena?
I'm sorry.
What interested you about teaching industrial relations?
It was a step-by-step accident to start with, but the more I became involved in it, it was the excitement of it. I'm going back to I started industrial relations in the late 90s. I first enrolled in 1958. I started industrial relations in the late 50s, 1958, 59, 61. By the time we get into the 60s, industrial relations is a major issue on the front page of many newspapers. By the time we get into the 70s, it's the number one issue on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, measured by square inches or what you wish. Industrial relations and all the frisance, the disputes, the carry-on, if you like. At UNSW, when in the first year I became Professor of Industrial Relations, we set up a program, an undergraduate program, that brought in students from other disciplines as well, just to study one or two units. And by about 2 years after that, by about the mid-1970s, there was something like 1,000 students studying a first-year industrial relations subject. About 200 of them went on to specialise in industrial relations, but the others did one or two subjects in industrial relations as part of their accounting or as part of their economics degree. So it was a central issue, far more central and far more, quote, important in an academic context than it might be seen to be today. That helped set a foundation, I think, for the development of the Industrial Relations Society. There are a number of origin paths for the society, but one of them was that there was an emerging academic discipline in the field which gave a base for a strong professional affiliation, so that the employer groups came in, the unions came in, the tribunals, which had very significant standing, came in, and the fourth arm to it, if you like, was the university-trained people, the academics. And I think without that, well, without all four, but certainly without the academic aspect, it would have been hard to put your hand up and say we're a standalone professional group, if you like. So all of that came together, and as it unfolded, those four arms, or whatever you wish to call them, would tend to wrestle with one another, and there were periods where there was much tribalism and things got pretty tedious, but in the end it always settled down and we moved on. And I think probably as a result of those exchanges, those points of tension, we became stronger and stronger. And that's why today you've got a society which has such an enormously rich and long heritage. It's quite remarkable, really.
And when did you join the society?
I think I joined as a student. I've got to say think, because I'm going back to 1959. I certainly remember John Kerr chairing a meeting or two that I was at. I was there as a student member of the Industrial Relations Society. I think by the time I went to America, I may have become a full member, but I was in America for 7 years, 6 or 7 years, and my membership may have lapsed at that point, but as soon as I came back, I rejoined. I was very active, or a very eager participant in the Terrigal conferences. They were a highlight of the year for the Industrial Relations Society. And then I've been a member of the Society ever since. So in one sense, my origin date for membership would be, I say, about 1959.
And what do you remember of John Kerr? Was he president of the Society then?
I remember almost nothing at that time. It was only later on that I put a face to a name, and they said, that's John Kerr. And it actually, his escapades a little later on with Gough Whitlam became something of a badge of honour for the Industrial Relations Society. At one point, there were people who thought the Society should own the responsibility for having given John Kerr one or two steps up the ladder, but in the end that didn't happen. It's just seen as a sidebar storyline to a very interesting period of development for the Industrial Relations Society. But the Society gave him some profile, some publicity, but he also gave some profile and publicity to the Society, certainly in the early years when he became Governor-General, before the event happened that changed everything.
And was there a similar society in the United States at the time?
There was. It was similar, but it was not. It was more a second cousin, not a sibling type society. It was much more academic than academic and practitioner, and there is indeed now still an American Industrial Relations, or whatever it's called, association or society. It was the basis for Tom Koken becoming president of the international body, and you can't get that without a strong domestic national society. But Australia, I think, because industrial relations has always had such energy about it, the society and the other entities here that are associated with the society have a much stronger array of activity than our counterparts offshore. I can't think of another country where industrial relations has the same punch as it does in Australia. That was part of the story when we went to the World Congress in Sydney in 2000, which was 2002. 2002. That was a very important development, but it also was an opportunity for Australia to see how different the world was, with all these people coming in from around the world, from their various associations and societies, as small as they may be, but they brought in different nationalities. There must have been 40 or 50 different passports in the room. And as the discussion unfolded, I think that helped Australia understand what a unique and different system it really had. I've sometimes thought of it as a hermit kingdom, industrial relations, but I don't get many pats on the back for that. But that World Congress, the first in the Southern Hemisphere that was held in Sydney, was a wonderful event, and I think it played an important part in helping to shift us from the particular DNA we had up to about the mid-70s through to the world we now see, where you don't have the tribunals so central, and the tribunals are of a very different nature from what they were back, say, in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. It, to me, underscored the point that a World Congress can be an agent of change itself by simply giving people a chance to come in, express views, and for Australians who tended not to go and study other systems, to see that, yes, there is some logic somewhere else in the world as well. It's not just, we became more reflective about aspects of our own system as a result of that. The Industrial Relations Society obviously played a critical role. You'd never have that World Congress here without the Society being as active as it was in winning the bid. That was a very important part of it.
And what leadership positions did you hold with the Society?
I was editor of the Journal of Industrial Relations for 18 years, a bit in the 70s through the 80s, a bit in the early 90s. That was a thoroughly enjoyable experience. There were tensions, there were periods when the society at large, particularly the employee groups and some of the union groups, wondered very strongly whether it was worth paying the money to have the journal, and perhaps we should give people a choice as to whether they subscribe to the journal. If either of those possibilities had happened, we wouldn't have a Journal of Industrial Relations today. In the end, the view always prevailed that the membership of the Society meant that you subscribed to the Journal of Industrial Relations, and that issue arose several times during my editorship. It's arisen since that time as well. I was president of the Industrial Relations Society of New South Wales, and then of the national body, and then of the international body. I guess outside the Industrial Relations Society, I've had several leadership roles in industrial relations. I started out as president of the Staff Association at ANU, and then I became president of FAUSA, which is the National Trade Union for Academics in Australia. and 25 years later I was chair of the employer body, the Australian Vice-Chancellors Committee. So I've had a journey from both directions. I have to say my colleagues at the University of New South Wales saw my move to the Vice-Chancellor role as something of a Benedict Arnold act. I had been head of the trade union, and then you move across. Forgiveness is hard to come by, I found sometimes. But anyway, it all settled down and things unfolded very well. But I found that interesting, having the role on behalf of the staff representing nationally. And I remember arguing the wage indexation case before Mary Gaudron on behalf of Australian academics, and then doing a similar thing behind the scenes when I was head of the employer body, the Australian Vice-Chancellors Committee. I remember the appearance before Mary Gaudron. I was by no means an experienced or skilled advocate. I was a lecturer and I could get very excited. And I remember in making the submission, I ran away with myself, and eventually I noticed that everyone around the room had put their notebooks down. And eventually Justice Gaudron said to me, Professor NIland, you have to remember that this is not a lecture. This is a tribunal hearing, and you need to speak slowly enough for people to take notes. Now, could you say all that again, please, but at about half the speed? She was good.
And you did some policy work for government as well, didn't you?
Yes, I did a couple of areas. I found myself in the field of environmental protection at one stage. I was the head of the Environment Protection Authority, and I developed some public policy there. And then there are other areas where I had interest in public policy, but of course the central part of my public policy interest and activity was in, well, what I guess you can generally call enterprise bargaining. I was asked by the Fay government in New South Wales to review the system that was in operation in New South Wales, and I produced a green paper, and that had a number of recommendations, and the key ones of which were that we should be moving away from a tribunal-dominated, not a tribunal present, but a tribunal-dominated system of dispute resolution, adopting the notion of the distinction between rights disputes and interest disputes, and then developing skills for negotiation which were quite different from the skills that are required for tribunal presentation. My report was issued, John Fay picked it up, and it was passed in New South Wales. At the same time, the Keating government became interested. Peter Cook, who was the Minister for Industrial Relations, I think at the time, commissioned me on behalf of Keating to do a similar report in respect of the Federal Public Service, and I prepared, or I chaired a committee that prepared a report on enterprise bargaining in the Federal Public Service. So I'd carried and had some work involvement with the Fay Liberal government in New South Wales, which was the first cab off the rank on enterprise bargaining, and then the Keating Labor government federally, and it was Keating who then really carried it forward and made enterprise bargaining, or more particularly the re-regulation that we saw in the system at large. He made that a reality, and so it went on. I also see a link there with the emergence of the superannuation system we have in Australia. Because we gave up the national wage case, you had to give up national wage cases and distribution of productivity at a national level if you're working on an enterprise bargaining basis. But what would have gone out in distribution to the employees of the country through the national wage case now started to get distributed through the superannuation system. It started out at 9%, and then now it's developing to a little bit more than that. But I think the Australian superannuation system is one of the 7 policy wonders of the world.
And when you were editor of the Journal of Industrial Relations, what did you try to achieve with that particular publication?
I tried to make several groups happy. I tried to give myself self-respect, which would come from hundreds of articles being submitted and people wanting to publish in the Journal of Industrial Relations. Similarly from my academic colleagues, that they would see it as a worthy vehicle for their hard work, their hard research. But I also was aware that financially and for other good reasons, if it didn't get the support of the practitioner community, it would not be able to fly the way I wanted it to. In the end, despite several trials and testing periods, we managed to get that done. And I think that's the strength of the JIR. Part of its strength now is its heritage. If you're a journal and you can say, you know, we are 40 or 50 or 60 years old, that stands. That's good. That's a good statement in these circles. So it's got that. But it also, I think, still has the enduring support of the industrial relations community. I keep saying, I guess, that there were periods of tension and periods of challenge, and there were people who wanted to break away. There was a certain secessionist element always sitting around the JIR, but it was always dominated by those who did not want to secede, who wanted to keep the JIR as part of the storyline of the society in Australia.
And what do you think are the strengths of the society? What does it bring to its members?
I think possibly one strength that I'd think of is its ability to settle disputes among its own people. It is a group of different entities, of employers, the trade unions obviously, federal government, state governments, tribunals, professional groups. Lawyers are increasingly active in the industrial relations society. It brings this diverse DNA together and holds it together despite remarkable changes that are going on in the world. I thought the time I was there was wonderful because enterprise bargaining seemed to be a thing you could talk about and people might not agree with you. In fact, most people did not agree with you, but it was a discussion that could be held. We're now back in that same period with COVID, post-COVID, people changing their work practices. I understand only too well the attraction of the hybrid life. I mean, academics have known that for 1,000 years. We work at home part of the time, then we come into the office and work there. And that's a wonderful exchange. And I've been making this point to many of my colleagues in the last year or so, and there was a friend the other day said to me, well, that's all very well. You may have had homework for the last 1,000 years, but you didn't have to homeschool at the same time. And I say, well, that's true. There are certain things we've yet to sort out, no doubt. But that was one part of it.
And just perhaps finally, because we're getting close to time, what do you think makes industrial relations a good career? Why should young people think about that as a career?
I think there are two parts to it. One is, are you interested in staying the course in industrial relations and moving through organisations to the highest level in industrial relations, but not necessarily in the organisation? Or are you interested in industrial relations being a stepping stone, if you like, to another career? If you, say, take BHP, which is where I started, the head of industrial relations at BHP is a very important position, whatever it's called these days. But the more important position is the chief executive of BHP. If some people would wish to simply be in industrial relations, that's what interests them and that's where they would spend their life. But if you wanted to move into the other direction, industrial relations is a wonderful foundation. It's something that everyone in that senior position, chief executive of the organisation, needs to have some adeptness with. And think of the industrial relations career both as a future direction in and of itself, but also an absolutely critical stepping stone for other directions if that's where you want to go.
And is there anything we've missed that you particularly wanted to talk about?
I'll be able to recognise and list that in the taxi home. I think we've done very well so far for the time we've had.
Okay. All right then. Well, thanks for your time.
Okay, you're more than welcome. Take care.